the HEIR planning group from University College Dublin. Just to run through some of the kind of rules, I'm sure you've kind of you're well acquainted with them at this stage, but just to say that we're recording all of the sessions, including the discussion. So if you don't want to be seen, please leave your camera off. James, that applies to you in this instance. And please, I would ask everyone again to please kind of keep your mics off until the end, and we'll take kind of questions at the end. Feel free to post questions or comments in the chat as we go, and we can kind of take those when we get to the end. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Newham from Northumbria University, who's going to talk to us about some absolutely critical work, very interesting work, looking at kind of an evidence-based approach to understanding student mental health and intervening. So I'll pass over to you, James.
Thanks very much for the introduction. And also it seems a bit ironic that I'm going to be talking about data analytics and I've still not quite mastered Teams calls 2 years into lockdown, etc. But so please do shout if anything is not looking correct or slides aren't working. So just to give a bit of context for this project. So this was framed as a research project and it was funded by the Office for Students, and it consisted of a number of different partners. So whilst Northumbria was the lead on this project, we had a number of different universities also collaborating on this. So I really want to stress Buckinghamshire New University was a critical partner with this, also like University of East London, but also we work with digital companies, also with charities, and also students themselves to make sure we get their perspectives. Now, when we talk about mental health in the university sector, there is a lot of upcoming like political and policy issues relating to this. So many of you will be aware of the mental health chartership, which universities are being encouraged to take part in. But also there's been quite a lot of press about like instances at Bristol University, Cambridge University, about looking at cases of students who have sadly taken their own lives and what can be done to try and improve services. But I think across the board, one of the increasing problems is that traditionally, like services that deal with the mental health issues of students are primarily reactive. We wait till the student is at a point of crisis and they get in touch. Now, the problems of this is that we know there are certain students that are more susceptible to mental health issues. So what can we do to engage with those students earlier? It's not preventative. So if we wait to a point of crisis, it becomes that much more difficult for a university to manage those students across different departments. And ultimately, it's not sustainable. And just to put these figures into context, so we know, so thankfully, rates of suicide are still very low. But at the same time, it's one of these things where some of the different dimensions of suicidal thoughts and behavior are surprisingly increasingly common, such as attempted suicide, planned suicide, suicidal thoughts, which when we apply what we know as the known statistics to our student population at Northumbria, if anti-stigma campaigns are great, but if we had nearly 8,000 students come into the door of counselling, we couldn't be seeing that many students. So we need to be thinking, what can we do proactively? And so, right, so this is like trying to think about preventative solutions. And one of the things that we can think about is mental health analytics. And this is a term that we use, but actually what that actually means on the ground can be a number of different things. And that's one of the things I want to try and spell out with this presentation. And so what mental health analytics has the potential to do is inform prevention by analysing a lot of this systematic operational data that floats around the university. So what can we be doing to act upon that data? But also trying to use some of the contextual data that we're sort of capturing in like snapshots of emails, etc., exchanges between departments, and try and synthesize that. And the idea is that if we are looking at data more introspectively, then we can try to think about, well, what is it that, I've been told that I've just appeared, so that's good to know. So the idea is that if we can look at data proactively, then the idea is that we can intervene with students earlier, and also we can get these students to have more autonomy, because then they're at a stage where they can actually engage with the resources that we have available. They're not at a point of crisis where they're trying to balance everything. But one of the things I really want to say about mental health analytics and this idea of like predictive systems is that we are not trying to predict suicide. The rarity of it means it's statistically just not a possibility. But what we're trying to do is take the data that we know to be meaningful, integrate that data so that we can create a safety net for students. So when we talk about that data, it's like, what data do we need to collect and why? And one of the partners on this project is James Murray, whose son sadly took his life at Bristol University. And he's been campaigning for the integration of data across universities. So it's like departmental data doesn't become siloed, so that we have a fuller whole student view, so we can see how this student is interacting across different departments, which is fantastic in principle. But actually, what data do we use and why? Because the important thing is there's so much data. How can you sort of like make a judgment about what's meaningful? And that's a big part of what this project was. So it's not just a case of data, more data is better. It has to be interpreted. So what data has been shown in the evidence to be meaningful? What data do universities collect already? The importance of the frequency of when that data is collected. Is it a case of it's collected at enrollment, and as soon as a student is on campus, that data all becomes obsolete? Is the data valid and reliable? Is there sensitivities in sharing that data for integrating it with different departments? And also, I think a big factor is the amount of data wastage. Why are we collecting this data? Can it actually be acted upon by staff? Or otherwise, what's the point really? And so a number of universities already use learning analytics, and I want to spell out some of the differences when thinking about learning analytics compared to mental health analytics or wellbeing analytics. So learning analytics often gets used as a short term for reporting on engagement, achievement, retention. But ultimately, what analytics is trying to do is you are trying to predict a future outcome. And this is the distinction from simply reporting on data of students. So at Northumbria, what we ask our analytic model essentially is that a specific question of what is a student's likelihood of still being a student on a future date. And so what it does is it's like, because we have historical data of students that have discontinued from university, we can compare the data trends of those students to our current student. And looking at the similarities, we can build what we call a likelihood score of from 0 to 100%. And the idea is that if we can see, okay, this student has a very high similarity to students we know that we're on a trajectory for discontinuing, we can engage earlier. We can signpost them towards library support services. And this is all done with student consent. Now, the difficulty with mental health analytics is that we don't historically collect data on students' mental well-being. Like, whereas a number of universities may do surveys about mental well-being, they're often anonymized and they don't have that consent to link it with other data the university keeps on them. And whilst retention could be an indication of mental health issues, we know there are plenty of students, there is never a risk of discontinuing, but still have a high amount of mental distress. We did consider, could we look at students that engage with counselling services and look at those students compared to future students? But again, those students that proactively make the step to come towards services, they're their own sort of bias subset in themselves. We want to find those hard to reach students, the ones that essentially are the underneath the iceberg. And so it became apparent that we needed to collect mental well-being data. But how do we do this? So again, it's like there's questions about, well, what's the most appropriate measure? So we want to get things that are validated. We need to use a scale that's validated. It's brief. Students are going to complete it because we need high numbers of students to fuel this model by this outcome data. We need something that's not clinically diagnostic. So in a large university at Northumbria, we have like 35,000 students. We can't ask them something like the Core 10, which asks specific questions about suicidality, because then there's a duty of care to then follow up on those students. And also we wanted something that wasn't a non-deficit measure. So it's not just looking at low mental well-being, it's also looking at high mental well-being. So we can also see what are protective factors. And so we ultimately chose the World Health Organization's 5-item mental well-being questionnaire. And over the course of 16 months at 3 different universities, we collected data at enrolment, through emails, and just to say at Northumbria, we collected over 47,000 responses from students at different time points. So, and this is a high amount of data that used in our model. But then that's looking at the outcome data. So we also want to look at the data that is predictive, the data that sits behind that. So many data models that are used in learning analytics, because you have that data, it's often not coming with an a priori hypothesis. Essentially, it's like pumping the data into the model, see what's associated, without really understanding, like, why is this important? What is it that actually is meaningful about this data? So what we really came to the thinking is we needed to do a lot of research activity to think, right, we want our model to be evidence-based. Everything that goes into it is meaningful. And so we did literature reviews. We did interviews with mental health practitioners and counsellors to get their perspectives. We did audits of our clinical caseload to see, well, what were some of the commonalities in the data of students that do present to counselling services that are particularly at risk? And then what we did was a big mapping task across the university. See, well, okay, we now know this data is meaningful, like finance data. Where do we keep this? We know this data is meaningful about parental education. Where do we capture this? And so whereas our learning analytic model had about 500 data variables in it already, we managed to include an additional 300 data variables of things that don't typically get looked at in terms of like educational success. So things about accommodation, finance, academic, personal extenuating circumstances, etc. So ultimately, in thinking about like our predictive model, we had data that was already in there, things such as grades, performance, we know to be associated. We collected self-report data as outcome data, but then we also did research activities to find new data sources that we could put into this system. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about how this would work in principle. So first of all, looking at the literature. So this looks a very messy slide, but what on the left, it's like these different categories of different type of data. So parental education, accommodation status, finance, religion, etc. And then looking at the studies, these large scale studies and like where they were conducted, sample sizes, were they looking at first years, postgraduates, etc. And then looking to see, did they or did they not find any associations with measures of suicidal thoughts and behavior? And so red would mean there was no association found. Green means, oh, okay, there's something there. So I think immediately just looking at this, there's a lot of red about accommodation status, which suggests that, well, actually, this might not be the important predictor that you think it is. Whereas religion seems to be very associated. So it's something about like, okay, right, maybe we need to think about religion in particular. But then also we wanted to verify this against like what practitioners and counselors say, like, is it just that this is associated or is it a proxy for something else? So one of the things they said about LGBTQ status, in terms of like their triage process, they wouldn't prioritize a student because they were LGBTQ. But also they were saying it's often a proxy for other things such as loneliness, discrimination. And it's like, well, actually, is it really capturing what we want, what we is actually the meaningful element of that association? But also asking questions about self-harm. We know non-suicidal self-injury is a big predictor, but asking simply about self-harm would mean that the number of cases that got elevated in our triage system, it would just not have the capacity that we could engage with that many students. And many students don't self-declare self-harm until they're actually engaged with services. So again, it gives us a different look of the data that's shown to be meaningful. And this is an idea of how we pull it all together. So evidence review, looking at sleep. Loads of studies showed that sleep was a really important predictor. The evidence was overwhelming. And when we asked our practitioners across 3 different universities, they often said like sleep was a really useful question to ask students. It's like a gateway into seeing how they're getting on. And so, right, sleep's really important. What data do we keep already? So things about like library access, like out of hours, things like how much they were engaging with VLE, like the virtual learning environments, Blackboard, etc. And we were able to create new data variables based on like nighttime use. So we just look at the same data in different ways. And the idea is that we can send tailored messages to these students that are showing their like behaviors that are associated with poorer mental well-being, like multiple logins throughout the night, about, well, where can they get specifically self-management strategies about sleep or 24-hour support services. And these sort of tailored messages we call nudges. And so just to talk a bit more about this concept of nudging, this is meant to be a very ugly slide. So this is like our webpage of all the resources, which are great. And it's showing like everything that a student could access, which is brilliant. But at the same time, it relies on the student making an informed decision about, well, what would work for them. And actually, you can sort of like break this down into that those that are really at risk, they're the ones that should really be considering practitioner appointments. Whereas those that are more moderate risk, they're the ones that should probably be taking like accessing guided self-help, etc. Whereas those that are doing quite well could be directed towards wellbeing workshops, etc. And so really, if we know different things about the student, like whether they're high risk, medium risk, low risk, we can then send very brief targeted messages about where they can access support. I think we're all sick to death of like, you get these 2 pages of all the different options of things that we can access, when actually, 150 words, that's going to resonate with someone, particularly someone who is feeling distress at that moment. And so this is bringing it all together, this figure. So the research and development informed what data is suitable to go into our AI data mining system, which gives a prediction of a student's likelihood of experiencing poor mental well-being. And then we can send tailored messages to low-risk students, medium-risk students, which essentially gets them to access those resources that are less costly for a university to provide. And the flip side of this, and I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about it too much, is we also recognize that actually a number of students aren't going to respond to this signposting and these nudges. And actually, but at the same time, it's useful for wellbeing services to have this data integrated. And there's also data that's just not appropriate to go into these big predictive models, such as like protected characteristics around religion, ethnicity, etc. And so we built a monitoring dashboard that provides our wellbeing services with access to data that they traditionally wouldn't have had access to, like finance, etc., disability status. And this is all underpinned by a model of consent. So students consent to this model. They consent to taking part in our analytic systems. And to build this consent model, we worked with JISC, with their author of Code of Practice of Wellbeing Analytics. This was reviewed by our data protection, by our data governance leads. We applied for research study ethics. We worked with students to improve the language. And then we gave students the ability to opt in and out. But one thing I want to stress is that also we did this across 3 different universities. And Matt Hiley-Rain, who's on the call, hopefully, can testify that this was quite an arduous battle, because we had different data governance leads at different universities who would see this different. We had different ethics teams, like ethics panels, giving different comments, but also the functionality of the different universities meant we had to adapt and trial different methods of getting students to consent to this. So at Northumbria and at Bucks, we were able to include it as part of the online enrolment, whereas this wasn't possible at the University of East London. And so we trialed email invitations. We also trialed different things about opt-in and opt-out. And then also like doing on-campus canvassing was something that could only be done at University of East London at the time. And we also emailed all 3 institutions, emailed to get students to complete the WHO5 at different time points throughout the year. And I'm happy to talk about this in more detail, but it's just to say that there's not just going to be one model that works for every university. And so when I talk about this building the model, so as mentioned, we brand this as mental health analytics, but we don't say this to students because it would be meaningless. So what we actually ask them to do is for their consent for the processing of their data and the receipt of tailored messages based on whether we think they're experiencing any risk. And then also we ask them to complete the mental wellbeing questionnaire. Students can opt out of both, which is absolutely fine. They still receive the same generic messaging. They still have the same access to services. So they don't lose out on anything. Ideal scenario for us is that they consent to both, and then we send them tailored messages based on how they self-report on these questionnaires. So if they were reporting very low well-being, they've consented for us to send them specific messaging about counselling. But even if they don't consent to the tailored messaging, but they just provide the questionnaire data, this is really useful because it helps us build this predictive model in the background. So essentially, we were testing nudges that were based on self-report data initially, but then we were testing them on the predictive model. And we're now at a stage where we're running this predictive model, so we don't need the data from students themselves. It runs independently. So what does this mean? So every student now has a prediction score based on the underlying data that we keep for all data. We're no longer reliant on static data from students themselves, but also what this model is really, because this model passes this benchmark, it's really useful because also what it does is it takes those 800 variables and it ranks them. So it can say what is the most predictive for your particular university, which is great because actually things that you wouldn't necessarily have prioritized in terms of strategy float towards the top. And actually it's like, okay, if we want to tackle mental well-being with our students, this is what we need to look at. And also one of the things to stress is that, again, we are predicting. So we can set the time frame for different points. So it could be 2 weeks in the future or 4 weeks in the future. But what we're essentially doing is saying that we're not trying to say where a student is now, it's where they will be in terms of their mental well-being in a couple of weeks' time. So that means we can send signposting to interventions so they can engage early. But what ranked particularly highly were personal extenuating circumstances requests, whether you were a young student on an older age cohort or an older age student on a younger cohort, whether you were the first in your family to go to university, nighttime use. We were really pleased to see that this floated towards the top. So whether they were accessing buildings, library, etc., out of hours, English as a first language, accommodation status, whether they were living with parents. But also we were able to see what wasn't influential, and finance data was shown to be a big factor. So I guess the big question is like, how accurate and effective is our model? And so one of the things I think a lot of different sectors, not just universities, healthcare generally, noticed that in 2020 in 2020 when lockdown hit, what we saw was a plateauing in the number of self-referrals to the counselling service. And so whereas we typically saw this trajectory of like, actually it's quite a steady cumulative rate across the year, we saw a plateauing. And it's one of these things where students probably didn't feel that they were warranted, that their concerns were sufficient to be trying to get intervention. And so in 2022, and I'm happy to talk about 2021, but just to say that in 2022, this is our standard rate of referrals. So those that just came through the system normally. As you can see, there's not a lot of difference than in lockdown years. And so actually there's still that worrying concern that people aren't coming forward. But using this nudging, we've been able to increase the number of self-referrals by 20%. And so it's showing a pre-COVID rate if we account those that came through via this nudging system. And also just to say, when we were basing these nudges on predictive data or self-reported data, what we found is that it showed the same proportion of responses at 28 days after the nudges went out. So again, it's shown the same responses either way, which is really encouraging. Oh, quite a few things seem to. Sorry, just lots of things seem to be popping up on my screen here. But also, it's not just a case of like the students that are coming to the, it's not just a case of getting more students through. We also want to see that those students actually warrant like receiving support. And what's interesting is that when we compare the students that came through via this nudging, whether it was through self-report, so the green, or nudges based on their predictive score, it was still, they were showing a higher likelihood of triggering a warning compared to standard referrals. But also just to say, and this is a confusing slide, but it's just to say that you get different response rates depending on the questions you're asking, whether you're asking about students that had suicidal thoughts or previous attempts or imminent risk. So it's just to say that actually the key message here is it wasn't just more students, it was more students at risk. And the encouraging message was also that in those students that we were signposting towards online support, those moderate risk students, we were able to show that of the caseloads that were coming in at 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, 28 days after the nudge went out, these were representing up to 80% of the students who were accessing that support. So some of these services that we provide, which just weren't being accessed, we were showing real spikes when we were doing this nudging. So I think a summary of some of the piloting here is that increasing the total number of referrals by 20% using this method, using both predictive and self-report nudges. And we encouraged self-registration in more at-risk students, and we were able to divert more students towards the less resource-intensive services. But also just to explain that we're dealing with numbers that when we're using this big population level approach, we're getting a registration rate of 1%, which might seem like, oh, what's the point? But that 1% translates to 50% of the caseload for the services. So it's a real important thing to consider the capacity and also the against response rates and trial and pilot, etc. I won't talk about the dashboard because I think this is probably rushing, but I am happy to talk about that in more detail. But just some final considerations that in terms of strategy, it's really important to think with analytics, what question are you actually trying to answer? And that makes a big difference in the data you're using. And also it's really important to establish clarity of ownership of who is going to be engaging with this. These systems don't run independently. They need interpretation and they need precision. But also thinking about operationally what data is meaningful for your university. And the most important thing you can do is try to understand your student population. And that's where this integration really helps. And also it's important to think about cutting and slicing that data in different ways, about time frame, format, etc., because that can make a big difference on how this influences the outcome. I think that's probably a bit of a whistle stop, but happy to answer any questions on that. I'm sorry if it was all a bit confusing with the presentation and screens, etc.
Not at all. No, that was absolutely fantastic, James. Thank you so much. Big data obviously kind of can have such a bad name that is just awesome to see it being used so sensitively and for such a really critical purpose, and such a valuable service to our students. So thank you very much. We don't have a huge amount of time left. I see we've kind of 2 questions there. Can I just skip the queue and just ask, I imagine there'd be a tremendous amount of interest in this, given kind of its importance and given how much you've covered. Where can people find out more?
They can email me at it should be the next slide. Yeah. Feel free to contact me. And like I say, this is very much a whistle stop tour, and we've got lots of different aspects to this, like monitoring dashboards where we integrate the data and aspects like that. Just looking at the questions quickly, the one about suicidality, again, it's just saying that some of the literature, they combined a composite score of thoughts, attempts, and plans, etc. So they measured it, but they didn't say exactly what dimension. The outcome variable of the model, retention, is in our learning analytics, but this is whether or not they are experiencing poor mental well-being as recorded, as defined on the HEIR in our mental health analytics questionnaire. And yes, Omar, happy to be in touch. But please get in touch, because I know it's like there's a lot to present there. But happy to talk about consent, data, like models, etc., whatever piques people's interest. Yeah.
And just to say as well that actually I will be following up with you myself as well, because there are projects kind of happening here at my university that certainly this ties in very closely with.
Great.
So on behalf of everyone, on behalf of the conference, thank you very, very much, James. That was really, really fascinating and such important work. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Well, thanks, James. I know it's not the same when you can't hear the round of applause, but you may be sure that we're all applauding in our kitchens. So I'll pass over to Steve now, who's our next